Hi, grace and peace, friends. It's Pastor Drew coming to you for our final Lenten Wednesday devotion and reflection. Again, we're not meeting in person during this season of coronavirus, where it's very important. And one of the ways that we can show grace and love and mercy towards our neighbors is by staying home if we can, or for those of us who are essential to the health and well-being of this country, so that's people working in grocery stores or hospitals, to go to work. But we need to do our part, those of us who aren't, and be at home. So I'm filming today from home again, but still want to share this message and word with you. We've been studying and focusing on that definition of God, the Lord, and returning to the Lord, who is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. I want to talk a little bit about that last word, steadfast love. The Hebrew word is chesed, and chesed is loving kindness. It's loving kindness that has existed from forever and goes on to forever. I think it's probably the kind of love that John is referring to in the letter when he says God is love. This big, great, the Greek agape love might be the closest kind of thing to this Hebrew chesed. It's God's loving kindness that is always with us, that endures, that is steadfast. And today we're going to hear a story of Moses encountering God in Exodus chapter 34. So I wanted to share that with you. The Lord said to Moses, "Cut 2 tablets of stone like the former ones, and I will write on the tablets the words that were on the former tablets which you broke. Be ready in the morning and come up in the mountain to Mount Sinai and present yourself there to me on top of the mountain. No one shall come up with you, and do not let anyone be seen throughout all the mountain, and do not let flocks or herds graze in front of that mountain." So Moses cut 2 tablets of stone like the former ones, and he rose early in the morning and went up on Mount Sinai as the Lord had commanded him, and took in his hand the 2 tablets of stone. The Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there, and proclaimed the name, the Lord. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty, but visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children and the children's children, to the 3rd and 4th generation. And Moses quickly bowed his head toward the earth and worshipped. He said, "If now I have found favor in your sight, O Lord, I pray, let the Lord go with us. Although this is a stiff-necked people, pardon our iniquity and our sin, and take us for your inheritance." God renews the covenant with Moses and with God's people. And God gives this definition, this description of God's self. That's why we use it in our gospel acclamation in the season of Lent. Return to the Lord your God. And we know that the Lord is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in chesed, steadfast, loving kindness. God reveals God's self to Moses. But Moses, the first time he sees God, just sees where God has been and sees the effects of God. And sometimes I feel like that's where we're at. I wonder where in this season you've seen God at work, and maybe an indicator is, where have you seen the effects of God? Evidence that God has been there. I had a professor that used to say part of the calling of a Christian is to be a detective of divinity, to follow the clues and point out where you've seen God. I think we could all use a little bit of that in this time. And a good way to realize if things are clues, or do they sound like or look like God? Well, what does God sound like and look like? What is God up to in the world? Well, God is gracious. God gives freely of God's self without expecting anything in return. God is merciful. God looks with kindness and mercy on God's people. God chooses to love rather than hate. God gives God's self away for your sake and for mine. God looks like the neighbor, the Samaritan neighbor who shows mercy. God is slow to anger. Friends, this is a crazy season with lots of emotions, and one of those can be anger. And sometimes there is real anger that needs to be felt and experienced. But when we find ourselves being quick-tempered, we remember God is slow to anger. And most of all, God is abounding in steadfast loving kindness. The two questions that I have for you to reflect on this week. The first one has to do with if this is the definition of God, that God is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, what does that mean for us? What does it mean to worship a God who is like this? And the second question is, if we're made in God's image, if we are bound together to be the body of Christ in the world, what does it look like to be a church that is gracious and merciful, that is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love? What does it look like to be a church where those are our core values and characteristics, the principles that we try and live out? What kinds of practices do we have to have if that's what we're after? Living into the image that God has placed in us, God's own image, one of grace and mercy, that's slow to anger, and that has loving kindness that goes on from eternity to eternity. Grace and peace.